Welcome to the Grace City Eugene podcast. We exist to help every person in our sphere of influence to encounter Christ, experience biblical community, and extend God's kingdom. You can learn more about us at gracecityeugene.com. Here's the podcast. Hello, Grace City family. Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Building. Casey Olson here with Pastor Chris Zahner.
What's up, fam?
And it's exciting to be here. The purpose of the Beyond the Building podcast is to have continued conversations about all things discipleship and missional living. Basically, what goes on once we leave our Sunday gatherings. We believe that church is meant to be so much more than just Sundays, and that following Jesus is more than just showing up for a few worship songs on Sunday mornings.
What?
And so, yeah, big surprise. And so the Beyond the Building podcast episode comes out third Friday of every month, I believe, and this is a space where we talk about those kinds of things. So, Pastor Chris, what are we talking about today?
What are we talking about today? Today, we are going to be in part one of a part two conversation, Casey, as you already know, because we've talked about it. And we're going to be talking about something called Parachurch Organizations. And we believe this warrants enough of a discussion, and there's enough kind of dynamic material surrounding this that we really wanted to not just skim the surface and give you kind of a brief dive into this, partially because both of us have had deep involvement in parachurch organizations over our life in serving Jesus. But also there's just a lot of nuance and history and some stuff that's helpful for us to understand as the church and as followers of Jesus about parachurch organizations. We don't claim to be the beholders of all knowledge about them. Amen. We are simply doing our best to help you as our family understand a little more of our heart, how and why we engage with these ministry organizations and why they are what they are.
Yeah.
And so, like I said, this will be part one of that next month, which is February. We will have part two of that. We recognize that, many of us watching this have heard about parachurch organizations, and you may have even participated in, been served by one, volunteered with one. There may be one that impacted your life. But we want to step back and take a look at what a parachurch organization's role is in kingdom ministry, kingdom expansion, just the kingdom work, if you will. And as we consider this, we want to explore also how we can partner with and engage with some of these amazing organizations. So like I said, it's going to be a two-part conversation today. We're going to introduce what a parachurch organization is, some of the benefits that come along with them. And then next month, we'll explore more how we partner with them as a church and as individuals. And we'll find that in part two, there are also some important considerations for us to think about as the local church, as an expression of the Church of Jesus Christ, and what a healthy involvement and perspective of these parachurch ministries, organizations look like. And so, again, we're not going to tick every box as far as the things that could be talked about, but because we have a heart for the mission of God and His kingdom to expand in our area, parachurch organizations are a huge part of that, and we want to make sure that our family has a healthy understanding of that. Yeah. So we want to start out with Casey just kind of giving us a little bit of definition of what a parachurch organization is and some of the history and origination of these organizations. So hit us with that teaching, Case.
Yes. Yeah, so those who are listening to this, you're probably not going to notice anything weird here. Those that are watching, I got a lot of notes here, so I'm going to be looking down for a minute, but it's because I don't want to miss anything. Like you said, this is a nuanced conversation. So a parachurch organization is a Christian faith-based organization that works outside of or across denominational lines to engage in discipleship, evangelism, and social welfare. When healthy, parachurch organizations come alongside the church and specialize in things that individual churches might not be able to specialize in themselves. Most parachurch organizations are Protestant or evangelical, though there certainly are some parachurch organizations in the Catholic tradition or in other faith groups as well. Some parachurch organizations can perform a variety of roles, including evangelistic crusade associations, kind of fill follow like the Billy Graham model, evangelistic or discipleship ministries, music and print publishers, radio and television stations, studios, or online ministries, study centers or institutions like schools, colleges, universities, welfare and social services like homeless shelters, childcare, domestic violence services, disaster relief programs, food pantries, and even more than that.
So much more.
And then finally, and something that is a little bit more modern to us too, is like Bible study groups. I know that there's even some folks in our church that are involved in some really cool Bible study organizations.
Yeah.
Parachurch organizations are relatively new. They've kind of been around for the most part, at least in the realm of what we're talking about today. Obviously, some of these things like academic institutions and whatnot, you could trace back much beyond that. But in kind of the modern scope of what we would look at a parachurch organization, they've been around for about 100 years. Many of these organizations and ministries were birthed in the 1920s and 30s during what's called the fundamentalist versus modernist controversy. This was a major schism that happened in the Presbyterian Church, where some liberal theological beliefs were beginning to come into a historically orthodox movement that challenged some of the core beliefs of the gospel. Now, when I say theologically liberal beliefs, I don't mean liberal in the political sense that we often think of today. There's a big difference between liberal in the political sense and then in the theological sense. When we talk about someone who finds themselves in a more liberal theological camp, it just means that they challenge some of the core tenets or beliefs of the historically orthodox tradition of Christianity. Some examples of this might be like the personhood of Jesus Christ. Was he really this God-man mix, or was he just a man that was supernaturally powered by God? They might challenge the legitimacy of the physical resurrection of Jesus. They might have some challenges to talk about the Trinity or different things like that. So that's where the modernist label in this fundamentalist versus modernist controversy comes in. This liberal theologians who had some challenges to some of the core beliefs and tenets of the Christian faith. And so basically there was this great split in the Presbyterian Church in the 1920s and 30s. And honestly, at the time, the modernists kind of won a lot of the influence there. If you look back, a lot of the publishing houses, a lot of the main streams of Christianity at that time kind of fell into this more liberal theology. But then over time, we see that the fundamentalist beliefs, the more orthodox Christian beliefs would kind of find themselves back in the majority by the 60s and 70s. And so basically, while this split was happening, some of the minority Christians left in this fundamentalist camp were basically left to themselves in many of their churches, that they were disappointed in some of the theological realms that their churches were finding themselves in, that they started to reach across denominational lines to say, I want to work with some other Christians that I believe still are holding to orthodox core beliefs. And so we started to see these groups and organizations come out of this time where people were willing to step out of their denomination, out of their faith tradition, to say, hey, we're a lot closer to one another than maybe someone else that might even be in my own denomination. So how could we collaborate? How could we work together to come together to further the gospel message? And so that's where we see a lot of these groups kind of come out originally. But then over time too, like a lot of parachurch groups, their stories more include recognizing like a specific issue or a difficulty in a community that wasn't being met by a local church. And so some folks would create their own organization. Most of the time when this happens, they didn't intend to create an organization. They just wanted to go out of their way to meet the need. And then over time, their model was replicated. And so they become an organization. But that's kind of the history of how we got to this, was through some weird theological schisms that resulted in folks wanting to work together, and then there being a lot of unique needs that people in communities wanted to reach.
And it's just fascinating how some things that bring great blessing, right, and great gospel movement came out of divisiveness.
Yeah.
And we always see that, right? Like, the script, God will use all things. God will use that. And what probably in that time seemed like, oh my gosh, the church is gone. Like it's destroyed what we know as like orthodoxy and all this. And that out of it, things that, for better or for worse, and obviously any organization, different regions, cities, leadership can change, how it is viewed in the effectiveness. But I mean, I was reached through a parachurch organization, right? So to see that even out of these times, which probably seemed like significant crisis, like so much cool stuff came out of it as God's people persistent, right?
Yeah.
And so, that's really cool, man.
Well, let's continue with that theme a little bit. Like you and I both have a little bit of history with parachurch organizations, as we mentioned earlier. Like, what is a little bit of your story and connection?
Yeah, my life was significantly impacted in high school by a parachurch organization. And I grew up in a really small logging town. You know where I grew up, right? And there was no real church that had any significant impact with youth and with the schools in our area. I mean, I can remember back, the only reason that anyone in town knew one of the pastors was because he was just the loudest guy always yelling at the refs at games. And I was like, oh, that's the guy from whatever church. If anyone from my hometown's listening to this, they're like, I remember that guy. And that's not to say there weren't good churches, but I was not aware of any sort of, outreach or support for youth. And what happened is there were some people that had this kind of burning desire or burden for the youth, and there wasn't any mechanism within the local churches, and some of them from different churches joined together and started a Young Life chapter in our hometown. And through that is actually how I came to know who Jesus was and have a personal relationship with him through Young Life, because it just took a couple people that were like, this is a need that's not being met. And a parachurch organization offered a solution where people from all different churches, all different, there's like 5 and like within a 20-mile radius, joined together and it unified them on mission. And it significantly impacted my life. So that was the first time I was exposed to any sort of parachurch organization. I wouldn't even been able to tell you that. I was just like, oh, that's a youth group, right? Yeah. Like, that's just very much a, leadership organizational term, parachurch organization. And then over time, I continued to work with Young Life as I moved into Corvallis. My first ministry role was with a parachurch organization called Relevance, who bought the Courtyard in Corvallis, which was a college co-ed Christian housing facility. So think like Christian fraternity and sorority in the same place, and thank God for the Christian part, so there wasn't purple, as far as we know, but like managing that. And so that technically, even though the owners of it were affiliated with a local church, it was intentionally set up to be a parachurch organization so that it could be a blessing in the body in that town, and people could go serve at whatever church they wanted. They were required to attend a local church, serve within a local church, but it wasn't just one specific church, which is really new for a like college housing. They're usually paid for, adopted by a local church. And so that was really cool. So literally my first 4 years in ministry was all parachurch organization based. And then I got to work with a group called Church of the Valley up in Corvallis, which is like the version of One Hope that we talk about here, but for Benton County, which seeks to unify the local evangelical churches, meaning missionally, biblically based, right? Christian churches, and to collaborate on initiatives in the community. And so those are also kind of a realm of parachurch organizations that I've had interactions with. Now, being around the campus world, there's all kinds of them, right? And there's too many that I've interacted with that I have just a high regard for. Maybe we'll talk more about them next week. But that's just a brief, some of the ones that were significant for me.
Oh, that's
what about you, man?
Yeah. Similarly, Young Life is where I got connected with my senior year of high school. But my story is a little different because I was already a Christian. I had attended church my whole life. I went to a Christian school. I'd kind of been all about the Jesus thing. But what was really cool for me in my experience with a parachurch ministry is it awoke something in me to care for the lost that I had not at that point in my life, whether it be just because of who I was and my age and immaturity and all these different kinds of things, or maybe it did have to do with some of the different circles and environments I had been in. I just never really been challenged to care a whole lot about those that didn't know Jesus, or at least I didn't feel very challenged. I'm sure there probably were plenty of people along the way that were saying that I should be. And Young Life really awoke something in me to care about the lost in our city. As I started interacting with these kids that weren't in my youth groups, weren't at my Christian school classes, I was like, man, these kids are very, very different than me. And they come from a really different world that I'm from. But at the same time, there's so many similarities. My parents are divorced. I've been through some of the things they've been through. And all of a sudden it was kind of like, man, I've got something I can offer to these kids because I've been in their shoes, but I've got a different worldview. I've got a different hope. And so I actually became a Young Life leader my freshman year of college. They let me jump through some of the initial requirements and whatnot.
Accelerated path.
And I got to lead high school right away, which was probably a no-go. But so I was leading high school Young Life when I was a freshman in college, did that for probably 2.5 years, and absolutely loved it. Grew my heart for the lost, cared deeply about connecting with these kids that seriously I had never thought about twice before. And so it was really cool. I mean, I thought I was going to work with them. That was kind of my dream, my goals, that I'd go on staff and all these kinds of things. God had different plans, and I ended up interning with Grace City Corvallis and ended up coming here and different things like that. But it was just a huge part of my life was awakening my heart to see man, there is some real brokenness that people in our town are going through, and they don't get to walk into Bible class on Monday mornings with amazing teachers that love and care about you and want to share the gospel with you. All of a sudden it was kind of man, this is going to be a cool opportunity to get to teach more people about the gospel. Yeah. And I'm grateful for it personally. I mean, that was first place I ever got to teach or preach or anything like that was at Young Life clubs with 150 high schoolers from town and different things. And for me, Young Life was a huge part of my story there for a bit, and I'm really grateful for it. It was cool. It really awoke something in me that I had never experienced before.
No, absolutely. And then we obviously as a church have a significant partnership with Youth for Christ, Lane County, and not just relationally and friendship wise, but we rent space from them. They are gracious to us in our arrangement there, opening it up for various needs that we have as a church. We have people that both volunteer, and Jess is on staff, and we have people that volunteer at clubs, and it's a really cool relationship, and it's a very similar thing to what we grew up with Young Life. But I love Parachurch Organizations. Yeah. Just like I love, I won't say just like, I also love the local church. Yeah. And with either of them, and this is next week's conversation, there are just things to look for that are indicators of health. Yeah. Right? And so stay tuned for next one for a little more conversation on that. Yes. But stories in the church or in the Parachurch Organizations. Yeah. So let's talk just some of the, as we wrap up, what are some of the benefits of parachurch organizations healthy parachurch organizations? Yeah. And again, when we say healthy parachurch organizations, I don't believe we can label any individual organization as binary, healthy or unhealthy. Yeah. Every city expressions look different, just like they do in local churches denominationally. Seasons of crisis and leadership and global challenges like we're seeing now can create hard times that do not change the identity or the capacity or effectiveness. It just means, man, this is a hard season. And just like I can have those in my personal life, in my professional life. So as we talk about this or say marks of a healthy or benefits of parachurch organizations, that's just very broad, ambiguous. We don't seek to label any group as not. Yeah.
It's too dangerous to.
It
like
is.
You
and
said,
who are we?
It's so nuanced. It's so different. I've heard people paint broad brushes over entire organization. And I'm like, well, that might have been true for that one club in that one city, that none of that staff works there even anymore. But it doesn't apply for that experience in a different city or for that expression somewhere else.
Absolutely. And I will go to war for Every Nation family and any of our churches. I pray that doesn't happen, but I would, because that's family.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I could go into any Every Nation church anywhere in the world and be like, that's absolutely a fit. I'm from Oregon, other people aren't. There's cultural and social different dynamics. And so that doesn't mean that that's not a place, right? And so we also have to recognize our own bias and our own preferences and how that influences things. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But what are some general benefits that make this a topic worth exploring for us?
Yeah, I think one point that I picked out in this was that it broadens the impact of the local church. Many hands make light work, and it creates specialized opportunities for more people to either be volunteering or to be employed in their full-time role, like my wife, to be out and about day after day, focusing on whatever mission or vision it is that they've been called to with their ministry. Really it just creates more opportunities for more people to be out and about doing the Lord's work, helping extend God's kingdom throughout our city.
Oh, absolutely. I think also there's just access that parachurch organizations can get that in the world we find ourselves in, people are unwilling to give access to churches.
It's true.
If I go to a school and I say, hey, I'm a pastor at a local church and I want to come serve your kids, they're going to be like, oh, church.
Right.
But if I say, hey, I'm from Campus Life, I'm from Young Life, I'm like, and I want to come serve, like, oh, that sounds like a youth specialized thing that could bring encouragement and positivity to our campus. They're going to give you access. And that can happen in parachurch organizations in the corporate world, right? In the professional settings where they just are able to get access that because of misconceptions or bad or even, maybe just kind of ambiguous impressions of the church, certain places may not give access. And in that access, they're able to bring a unifying force of the church into areas that otherwise a church like Grace City wouldn't be able to serve and get into. So I think that's a cool thing about them as well. Absolutely.
And I think too, like another facet in it is that it offers some really specialized, cool ministries that, like, especially you think about in the context of our church, things that we don't have the manpower for, that we don't have the financial resources for, different things like that, that we can occasionally come alongside and say, hey, how can we help support this? How can we help empower this? Like, it's just a way for us to say, to humbly look at our city and say, we are not big enough, great enough, to go meet every need of our city. And so it allows for some really specialized opportunities for people groups to be cared for.
Yeah. I think one of the things we'll talk about next week is how some of the, you even mentioned it, some of these things are birthed out of the inability or unwillingness of local churches to maybe meet some needs. But I think part of it too is maybe a church recognizes a specialized need that they cannot do as well as if they created a parachurch specialized organization, right? That is all about construction and rebuilding homes after natural disasters. Like that can be started by a church, but a church has to recognize it's the limiting factors of being in their primary mission, but they can start this organization that goes and mobilizes and can employ builders and get grants and access to things that the church wouldn't be able to because they are specialized. So it provides a specialized, diverse ability that the church can be mobilized through. And I think that's a really cool aspect of these organizations.
Absolutely. And I think, in that point of what you're saying, like, sometimes these groups established because of a need that the local church is not meeting, is that I think a real benefit to that is that it calls us to action. Absolutely. I mean, I think about my story with Young Life. Like, I had been a Christian my whole life in all of these circles and environments that you would have thought I'd have it ingrained into who I was, that like I was supposed to be out caring about the lost and making more disciples. But it took this parachurch organization for me to like realize, wow, I don't think anything I've ever been a part of has really pushed me like that to
Yeah.
go be a part of it.
That's really
And
good.
praise the Lord, I'm really grateful for the Grace City family and Corvallis, and then here that really cares about a missional life, that cares about the lost, because I found that in my local church, but it was something that I hadn't experienced, that I hadn't really felt a deep conviction about. But then when I saw someone who was doing what I felt like the church should have been doing, it was like, okay, I gotta be more about that, and I gotta find who are the people that really care about this and that are prioritizing this as the church.
Oh, that's great. And I think for the sake of today, one of the final benefits, especially of a healthy parachurch organization, is that they point people to the local church.
Yeah.
They bridge gaps and they point to the body of Christ. They don't try to be an instead of an alternative to it. And one of the things that I love about Youth for Christ, their goal is to point kids to the church and bridge that gap. And I know there's a ton of other organizations. That's just shameless plug. But yeah, that's, I think, another benefit. And I think we can never do an exhaustive list of the benefits of these organizations because we don't know about all of them. But I think hopefully this gives you a good starting point as you ponder what are these organizations, and maybe think about what ones have I been engaged in, what has God given me a heart for, that my local church or expression may not have the capacity to specifically engage in, that I need to seek something out. And that will kind of prime the pump for our conversation next time with part 2 as we dive deeper into this. But I pray in the meantime, do a little research. Ponder, how has my life been impacted by these organizations? How can I pray for them, and see what God might put on your heart as we approach our conversation next month. So as always, you can like this, you can share it if there's something in it that was encouraging to you. Subscribe to be able to get, notifications when we put out these videos. Our hope is that this will encourage you as a follower of Jesus, or maybe as someone who's just trying to figure out what it looks like to love and follow Jesus. And that this will help us be a better example or expression of a community of Christ, wherever it is that God has planted you. And so we thank you for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you next time and appreciate you spending this time with us.